The wedding dress felt like a noose around Eleanor Norton's throat, as she stood alone in the little wooden chapel on the outskirts of Buffalo, Wyoming, watching the last of the pitying guests file out into the dusty June afternoon of 1878. Thomas Garrett had left her standing at the altar without so much as a word of goodbye, his brother stammering through an explanation about how Thomas had decided to head west to California instead, that marriage just wasn't for him anymore, that he was terribly sorry, but Thomas was already 3 hours gone. The humiliation burned hotter than the summer sun beating down on the prairie outside, and Eleanor wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floorboards beneath her satin slippers. She stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, staring at the simple wooden cross hanging behind where the Reverend had waited with his Bible open, ready to perform a ceremony that would never happen. The flowers her mother had picked that morning were already wilting in the heat, their sweet scent turning cloying and thick. Everything was wrong, and Eleanor couldn't quite make her feet move, couldn't quite process that her entire future had just evaporated like morning dew. "Madam." A deep voice spoke from behind her, gentle but uncertain. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you all right?" Eleanor turned slowly, her veil still pinned in her carefully arranged auburn hair, and found herself looking at a tall cowboy standing in the chapel doorway. The late afternoon sun behind him cast him in silhouette, but she could make out broad shoulders, dusty trail clothes, and a worn hat he was holding respectfully in his hands. As her eyes adjusted, she saw he had kind eyes, a deep brown that held genuine concern, and a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-20s, not much older than her own 22 years. "I'm fine," Eleanor lied, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Just having a moment." The cowboy shifted his weight, his boots creaking slightly on the wooden floor. "I was passing through town, stopped to water my horse, and folks were talking about what happened." "That takes a special kind of coward to leave a woman waiting like that." "I'm real sorry, madam. You didn't deserve that." Something about his straightforward sympathy, offered without pity or judgment, made the wall Eleanor had built around her emotions crack just slightly. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say. I should probably go home now before my mother comes looking for me. She's probably beside herself with worry." "Would you like some company for the walk?" the cowboy asked. "Name's Everett Foster, by the way. I work the cattle trails mostly, but I'm between drives right now. Figured I'd spend a few days in Buffalo before heading back out." Eleanor studied him for a moment, trying to determine if his offer was genuine kindness or something else. She'd just been abandoned by a man she'd known for 2 years, so her judgment clearly wasn't the best. But something in Everett Foster's open expression suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a decent man who saw someone hurting and wanted to help. "Eleanor Norton," she said finally, reaching up to unpin the veil from her hair. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the pins free, and she felt rather than saw Everett step closer, ready to help if she needed it but not presuming. "And yes, I suppose some company would be nice. It's about a mile walk to my family's homestead. I'll get my horse from the livery and walk with you if that's all right," Everett said. He could use the exercise anyway after being cooped up. They left the chapel together, Eleanor still in her wedding dress, Everett with his hat back on his head, shading his eyes from the bright Wyoming sun. The main street of Buffalo was quiet in the afternoon heat, most people taking shelter indoors until the worst of it passed. The town wasn't large, just a few dozen buildings clustered along the dusty road, but it was growing steadily as more people moved into the territory. Eleanor had lived here her whole life, and suddenly she felt like everyone was watching her, judging her, pitying her. Everett collected his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a white star on its forehead, from the livery stable and fell into step beside Eleanor as they headed east out of town. For a while they walked in silence, the only sounds the clip-clop of horse hooves on the packed dirt and the rustle of Eleanor's dress. "You don't have to make conversation," Everett said after a few minutes. "I know this has to be just about the worst day of your life, and sometimes silence is better than empty words." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by his perceptiveness. "You're not what I expected when I think of a trail cowboy. No offense meant." "None taken," Everett replied with a slight smile. "My mom made sure I had some manners before she passed. Said just because a man works with cattle doesn't mean he has to act like one." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Everett agreed. "Lost her to fever when I was 17. My pa had already passed a few years before that, so it was just me and my younger sister after that. I worked ranches around Texas and Kansas, saved up enough to send my sister to live with our aunt in St. Louis where she could get a proper education. She's 19 now, training to be a teacher." "You must be proud of her," Eleanor said, grateful to be thinking about something other than her own disaster. "I am," Everett confirmed. "She writes me letters when she can, sends them to general delivery in whatever town I tell her I'll be passing through. Just got one last week telling me she's got a beau courting her properly. Some accountant's son." They walked on, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly in Everett's presence. He didn't push her to talk about what had happened, didn't offer platitudes about how she was better off without Thomas, didn't make her feel like she needed to perform or pretend. He just walked beside her, leading his horse, occasionally pointing out a hawk circling overhead or commenting on the quality of the grassland they were passing through. "That's our place," Eleanor said as they crested a small rise and she could see the homestead spread out below. It wasn't much, just a modest house her father had built 15 years ago when they'd first claimed the land, a barn, a chicken coop, and some fencing for their small herd of cattle. Her father supplemented their income by working as a blacksmith in town, and her mother took in sewing when she could. It was a hard life but an honest one, and Eleanor had always been proud of what her parents had built. As they approached the house, Eleanor's mother came rushing out, her face lined with worry. Martha Norton was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had a strength that came from years of frontier living. When she saw Eleanor still in her wedding dress with a strange cowboy beside her, she stopped short. "Eleanor, honey, are you all right?" Martha asked, her eyes flicking between her daughter and Everett with obvious questions. "I'm fine, Mama," Eleanor said, though her voice wavered slightly. "This is Everett Foster. He was kind enough to walk with me from town. Mr. Foster, this is my mother, Martha Norton." Everett tipped his hat politely. "Madam, I'm sorry to meet you under such circumstances. I'll be on my way now that Miss Norton is home safely." "You'll do no such thing," Martha said firmly, her natural hospitality overcoming her suspicion. "It's nearly dinner time and you walked all this way. The least we can do is offer you a meal. Eleanor, honey, why don't you go change out of that dress while I get things ready?" Eleanor nodded gratefully and hurried inside, desperate to be out of the constant reminder of her humiliation. In her small bedroom, she carefully removed the dress that had taken her mother 3 months to sew, each stitch made with love and hope for Eleanor's future. Now it just felt like a monument to her foolishness. She folded it carefully and placed it in her trunk, wondering if she'd ever be able to look at it without feeling this hollow ache in her chest. She changed into a simple calico dress and pinned her hair into a more practical style, then stood for a moment, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. Her green eyes looked tired, and there were already faint lines around them from squinting in the prairie sun. She wasn't a great beauty, she knew that. She was too tall, too thin, her features too sharp. Thomas had said he loved her anyway, but apparently that hadn't been enough. When she returned to the main room, she found Everett helping her mother set the table while her father, Samuel Norton, stood by the fireplace talking with him. Samuel was a big man, broad-shouldered from years of blacksmith work, with graying hair and a weather-beaten face. He looked up when Eleanor entered and crossed to her immediately, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, little bird," he said softly, using the nickname he'd given her as a child. "Thomas is a fool and a coward, and I'll be having words with him if he ever shows his face around here again." "Papa, please don't," Eleanor said, pulling back to look at him. "It's done. I just want to forget about it and move on." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "If that's what you want. But know that this reflects on him, not on you. You did nothing wrong." Dinner was a simple affair. Stew made from salt pork and vegetables from Martha's garden, fresh bread and butter. Everett ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting Martha's cooking sincerely. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily, with Samuel asking Everett about his work on the cattle trails and Everett asking about Samuel's blacksmith business. Eleanor mostly listened, grateful that the attention wasn't on her for once. "How long are you planning to stay in Buffalo?" Samuel asked as they finished eating. "I was thinking a few days," Everett replied. "I've got some money saved up, and I was considering maybe looking for something more permanent. I'm getting a bit old to be spending months on the trail twice a year. Was thinking maybe I could find work on one of the ranches around here." "The Morrison Ranch might be hiring," Samuel said thoughtfully. "It's about 10 miles north of here. Big operation, running a couple thousand head. Owner's a fair man named Henry Morrison. If you're interested, I could put in a word. He comes into my shop regular to have work done." Everett's eyes lit up with interest. "I'd appreciate that, sir. I've got good references from the last few outfits I've worked with." "Come by my shop tomorrow morning," Samuel offered. "Morrison usually stops in around mid-morning. I'll introduce you." "Thank you kindly," Everett said. "That's more generosity than I expected when I decided to check on a lady in distress this afternoon." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at being referred to, even indirectly. She stood and began clearing the dishes, needing something to do with her hands. Her mother joined her, and together they washed up while the men moved to the front porch where it was cooler. Through the open door, Eleanor could hear the low rumble of their conversation, though not the specific words. "He seems like a good man," Martha said quietly as she dried a plate. "Very different from Thomas." "Mama, I just met him," Eleanor protested, though not very strenuously. "And after today, I'm not exactly eager to trust my judgment about men." "Thomas always was all flash and no substance," Martha said. "I never said anything because you seemed happy, but I always wondered if he had the backbone to really commit to frontier life. Too many big dreams and not enough willingness to do the hard work to achieve them." Eleanor had to admit her mother had a point. Thomas had talked endlessly about striking it rich, about moving to San Francisco or Denver, about all the grand things they'd do once he made his fortune. He'd worked sporadically at various jobs around Buffalo, but never seemed to stick with anything long enough to make real progress. She'd convinced herself that he just needed the right opportunity, that marriage would settle him down. Apparently, she'd been wrong. "Mr. Foster seems like the opposite," Martha continued. "A man who knows hard work and doesn't shy away from it, and the way he spoke about his sister, making sure she got an education, that shows character." "He was very kind today," Eleanor admitted. But Mama, after what happened, I don't think I can even think about men or courtship or any of that for a very long time. Maybe ever. Martha set down her dish towel and turned to face her daughter, placing gentle hands on Eleanor's shoulders. I understand, honey. Today was terrible and you have every right to be hurt and angry. But don't let Thomas's cowardice make you give up on the possibility of love. Not all men are like him. Your father certainly isn't. Eleanor nodded, blinking back tears that threatened to fall. I know, Mama. I just feel so foolish. How did I not see that he was going to do this? Because you trusted him, and there's no shame in that, Martha said firmly. Trust is part of love. He's the one who should be ashamed for betraying it. They finished the dishes in companionable silence, and then Eleanor excused herself to her room, claiming exhaustion. It was true enough. She felt wrung out, empty in a way she'd never experienced before. She could hear Everett saying his goodbyes, thanking her parents again for their hospitality, his deep voice carrying through the thin walls. Then the sound of horse hooves fading into the distance as he headed back to town. Eleanor lay on her bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the rough wooden ceiling. Tomorrow the gossip would really start, she knew. Everyone in Buffalo would be talking about how Eleanor Norton got left at the altar. Poor thing. What a scandal. What will she do now? The thought made her want to stay in this room forever, but she knew that wasn't realistic. She'd have to face people eventually, had to hold her head high and prove that Thomas Garrett hadn't broken her, even if right now she felt like he had. The next morning, Eleanor woke early despite having barely slept. She helped her mother with the morning chores, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, milking their one dairy cow, and starting breakfast. Her father had already left for his shop in town, wanting to be there early in case Henry Morrison came by before his usual time. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor's heart jumped into her throat, some irrational part of her hoping it might be Thomas, come to apologize and explain and make everything right. But when Martha opened the door, it was Everett Foster standing there, hat in hand, looking freshly cleaned up. "Good morning, Mrs. Norton," he said politely. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you again for dinner last night and to let you know that Mr. Norton was kind enough to introduce me to Mr. Morrison this morning. I've got a job starting tomorrow at the Morrison Ranch." "That's wonderful news," Martha said warmly. "Please come in. I've just made coffee." Everett stepped inside and his eyes found Eleanor where she stood by the stove. "Good morning, Miss Norton. How are you feeling today?" "Better, thank you," Eleanor said, and she was surprised to find it was partially true. She wasn't fine, not by a long stretch, but the sharp edge of yesterday's humiliation had dulled slightly. "I'm glad you found work. Papa speaks highly of Mr. Morrison." "He seems like a fair man," Everett agreed, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. "The work will be hard, but I'm used to that, and it'll be good to have a steady place to be instead of always moving." "Will you be staying in the bunkhouse at the ranch?" Martha asked. "Yes, madam." "Mr. Morrison said there's room and board is included with the wages. I'll be working with the horses mostly, which suits me fine. I've always had a way with them." They talked for a while longer, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in Everett's presence again. He had a way of making conversation feel easy, never pushy or demanding, just naturally flowing. When he eventually took his leave, promising to stop by when he had a day off to let them know how the work was going, Eleanor realized she was looking forward to seeing him again. The weeks that followed were difficult for Eleanor. As she'd predicted, the gossip spread quickly through Buffalo. Some people were sympathetic, others seemed to take a certain satisfaction in her misfortune, and a few even suggested that she must have done something to drive Thomas away. That last group made Eleanor furious, but she held her tongue and kept her head high, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She threw herself into work, helping her mother with the endless tasks of keeping a homestead running, taking on extra sewing projects to bring in a bit of money, and occasionally helping her father in his shop when he needed an extra pair of hands. The physical labor helped keep her mind occupied during the day, though the nights were still difficult, full of second-guessing and wondering what she could have done differently. Everett came by the homestead every Sunday afternoon, his one day off from the Morrison ranch. At first, Eleanor thought he was just being polite, repaying her family's hospitality with visits and usually a small gift. Wildflowers he'd picked on the ride over, a rabbit he'd caught for stew, once a beautiful piece of turquoise he'd won in a card game that he insisted Martha should have. But as the visits continued, Eleanor began to realize that Everett's eyes lingered on her, that his smiles were warmest when directed her way, that he always seemed to position himself near her when they sat on the porch talking. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. Part of her was flattered. Everett was handsome in a rugged way, and he was undeniably kind and hardworking. But another part of her was still raw from Thomas's abandonment, still afraid to trust her own judgment, still worried that she was seeing something in Everett that wasn't really there. One Sunday in late July, about 6 weeks after the failed wedding, Everett arrived at the homestead with a proposition. "Mr. Morrison is having a barn dance next Saturday night," he said. "He throws one every summer for all the ranch hands and the neighboring families. There'll be music and dancing and plenty of food. I was wondering if you and your family might like to come as my guests." Samuel and Martha exchanged glances, and then both looked at Eleanor. She knew what they were thinking. It would be good for her to get out to socialize, to show everyone that she was doing fine. But the thought of facing all those people, of being the object of curiosity and pity, made her stomach clench. "I don't know," Eleanor said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." "I understand," Everett said quickly. "But I want you to know that you wouldn't be alone. I'd be right there with you the whole time if you wanted. And lots of the folks coming are from surrounding ranches and homesteads. Most of them probably haven't even heard about what happened." "Please consider it, honey," Martha urged gently. "It might do you good." Eleanor looked at Everett, at the hope in his eyes and the sincerity in his expression. He wasn't pushing, just offering an opportunity. And suddenly she realized that she was tired of hiding, tired of letting Thomas's actions control her life. "All right," she said. "I'll go." The smile that spread across Everett's face was worth the anxiety that immediately followed her decision. "That's wonderful," he said. "I'll come by Saturday afternoon to escort you all to the Morrison place." The week leading up to the dance was nerve-wracking for Eleanor. She helped her mother alter one of her nicer dresses, a deep blue cotton with a full skirt and fitted bodice that brought out the color of her eyes. She practiced dancing with her father in their small front room, laughing despite her nervousness when he deliberately stepped on her toes to make her smile. Saturday arrived hot and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. Everett showed up in the early afternoon driving a borrowed wagon, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt that Eleanor suspected he'd paid someone to iron for him. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd obviously shaved recently. He looked nervous himself, which oddly made Eleanor feel better. The Morrison ranch was impressive, even more so than Eleanor had imagined. The main house was a large 2-story structure built of local stone, and the barn where the dance was to be held was enormous, easily big enough to hold 100 people or more. As they drove up, Eleanor could see that preparations were well underway. Long tables were being set up outside the barn, and several women were arranging food. Lanterns were strung up both inside and outside the barn, ready to be lit when evening fell. Henry Morrison himself came out to greet them, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and a booming voice. "Sam Norton, good to see you," he said, shaking Samuel's hand vigorously. "And you must be Mrs. Norton. Everett's told me how kind you folks have been to him. And this must be your daughter." Eleanor braced herself for the look of pity or recognition, the awkward acknowledgement of what had happened to her, but Morrison simply smiled and tipped his hat. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Norton. We're glad you could join us tonight." Either Morrison genuinely hadn't heard about the failed wedding, or he was too polite to mention it. Either way, Eleanor was grateful. She found herself relaxing as Everett introduced them to various ranch hands and their families. Most people were friendly and welcoming, and if a few of the women from Buffalo who'd made the trip whispered behind their hands when they saw Eleanor, she did her best to ignore them. As evening fell and the lanterns were lit, a small group of musicians set up in one corner of the barn. There was a fiddle player, someone with a guitar, and an older man with a harmonica. They started with a lively tune that got people's feet tapping, and soon couples were taking to the makeshift dance floor. Everett appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" he asked formally, offering his hand. Eleanor hesitated for just a moment, then placed her hand in his. "I'd be delighted." Everett led her onto the floor and pulled her into a respectable position for a reel. He was a good dancer, Eleanor discovered, confident in his movements and sure-footed despite his size. They moved through the patterns of the dance, joining hands with other couples, spinning and stepping in time to the music. Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, as Everett twirled her perhaps a bit more enthusiastically than strictly necessary. When that dance ended and a slower waltz began, Everett looked at her questioningly. "One more?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, and this time when he took her in his arms, they were much closer. His hand was warm on her waist, and she could smell the faint scent of soap and leather and something uniquely him. They moved together smoothly, and Eleanor realized that she felt safe with him, comfortable in a way she'd never quite felt with Thomas. "Thank you for coming tonight," Everett said quietly as they danced. "I know it wasn't easy for you." "Thank you for inviting me," Eleanor replied. "You were right. It's good to be out, to remember that there's more to life than dwelling on the past." "Eleanor," Everett began, then paused as if gathering his courage. "I want you to know that I think Thomas Garrett is the biggest fool in Wyoming for letting you go. And I know it's probably too soon, and I don't want to presume anything, but I'd like permission to court you properly. If you're willing." Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but the cautious part that still hurt spoke up. "Everett, I appreciate that more than you know, but I'm still recovering from what happened. I don't know if I'm ready for courtship." "I understand," Everett said, and she could see the disappointment in his eyes even though he tried to hide it. "But will you at least let me keep visiting? As a friend, if nothing else. I've come to care a great deal about you and your family, and I'd hate to lose that." "I'd like you to keep visiting," Eleanor said softly. "And maybe in time I'll be ready for more. I just need you to be patient with me." "I can be patient," Everett assured her. "You're worth waiting for, Eleanor Norton." They danced 2 more dances together before Eleanor's father claimed her for one, and then she found herself dancing with several of the Morrison ranch hands who Everett introduced her to. It was actually pleasant, being treated like a normal woman at a social gathering instead of an object of pity. By the time the evening wound down and Everett drove them home under a canopy of stars, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in weeks. The rest of the summer passed in a gentle pattern. Everett continued his Sunday visits, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to them more and more. They would walk together around the homestead, talking about everything and nothing. Everett told her stories about his adventures on the cattle drives, about the places he'd been, and the things he'd seen. Eleanor shared her dreams of maybe one day having her own dressmaking shop in town, of creating beautiful things with her hands. Slowly, almost without Eleanor realizing it, her feelings began to shift. She noticed the way her heart sped up when she saw Everett riding up the road to the homestead. She caught herself thinking about him during her daily tasks, wondering what he was doing, if he was thinking about her too. When he laughed at something she said, she felt warm all over. And when he touched her hand in passing or offered his arm when they walked, she didn't want him to let go. It was September, the air finally cooling from the oppressive summer heat, when Eleanor realized she was falling in love with Everett Foster. The realization came one Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Everett was telling her about a particularly difficult horse he'd been working with at the ranch, his hands moving expressively as he described the animal's quirks and personality. Eleanor found herself not even listening to the words, just watching his face, the animation in his eyes, the way his whole being seemed to glow when he talked about something he cared about. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not the anxious uncertainty she'd felt with Thomas, constantly wondering if he was happy, if she was enough, if he really meant the things he said. With Everett, everything was straightforward and honest. When he said something, he meant it. When he promised something, he followed through. He was steady and reliable and kind, and somewhere along the way, those qualities had captured her heart more surely than any grand romantic gesture ever could. "Everett," she said, interrupting his story about the horse, "I need to tell you something." He stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with concern. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Eleanor assured him. "Better than fine. I just wanted to say that I've thought about what you asked me at the barn dance about courting, and if the offer still stands, I'd like to say yes." For a moment, Everett just stared at her as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious expression into something radiant. "The offer definitely still stands," he said. "Eleanor, you've made me the happiest man in Wyoming." "I can't promise I won't be cautious sometimes," Eleanor warned. "What happened with Thomas, it hurt me badly. I'm still learning to trust again." "I know," Everett said gently. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "And I'll prove to you every single day that I'm not him. I'm here, Eleanor, and I'm not going anywhere. His loss truly is my blessing." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. She squeezed Everett's hand. "Thank you for being patient with me." "Thank you for giving me a chance," Everett replied. They sat there as the sun set, hands clasped, not needing to say anything more. Inside the house, Eleanor could hear her mother humming as she prepared dinner and her father's footsteps as he moved around. Everything felt right in a way it hadn't for months, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into their proper places. The courtship that followed was everything Eleanor had never known she wanted. Everett was attentive without being smothering, respectful without being distant. He continued his Sunday visits, but now he also came by on Wednesday evenings after work, riding the 10 miles from the Morrison Ranch just to spend a couple of hours with Eleanor before riding back in the dark. He brought her small gifts, a book of poetry he'd ordered from a catalog, a pretty ribbon for her hair, a set of delicate buttons made from bone that he thought she could use in her sewing. Nothing extravagant, but each gift showed that he'd been thinking about her, paying attention to the things she liked and needed. In October, Everett asked Samuel's permission to take Eleanor into Buffalo for a social at the church. It would be the first time Eleanor had been to a public gathering in town since the failed wedding, and she was nervous. But with Everett's steady presence beside her, she found she could face the whispers and stares. And when several women who'd been particularly catty about her situation saw her with Everett, looking happy and clearly courting, Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction. At the social, Everett stayed close to her side, introducing her to people he'd met through his work at the Morrison Ranch, making sure she always had a glass of punch and someone to talk to. He danced with her 3 times, which was pushing the bounds of propriety for a courting couple, but Eleanor didn't care. She was tired of worrying about what people thought. For the first time in her life, she was going to do what made her happy. As they were leaving, they ran into Thomas's younger brother, Jacob, the one who'd stammered through the explanation at the wedding. He looked deeply uncomfortable when he saw them, and Eleanor braced herself for an awkward conversation. "Miss Norton," Jacob said, tipping his hat. "I hope you're well." "I'm very well, thank you," Eleanor said, surprised by how true that statement was. Jacob glanced at Everett, then back at Eleanor. "I wanted to apologize again for my brother's behavior. It was inexcusable, and our whole family is ashamed of what he did to you." "Have you heard from him?" Eleanor asked, more out of curiosity than any real interest. "One letter," Jacob admitted. "He made it to California, apparently. Sounds like he's barely scraping by, working odd jobs in San Francisco." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I think he realized he made a terrible mistake, but he's too proud to admit it." "I hope he finds what he's looking for," Eleanor said, and she meant it. She didn't love Thomas anymore, she realized. Whatever feelings she'd had for him had faded completely, replaced by something much stronger and more real with Everett. "But I've moved on, and I'm happier than I ever was with him." Jacob's eyes flicked to Everett again, and he gave a small smile. "I can see that. You look happy, Miss Norton." "I'm glad." He tipped his hat again and walked away. "That was very gracious of you," Everett said as they walked to where he'd tied his horse and the small buggy he'd borrowed for the evening. "I meant it," Eleanor said. "I'm not angry at Thomas anymore. Actually, I'm grateful to him." Everett looked surprised. "Grateful? If he hadn't left me at that altar, I never would have met you," Eleanor explained. "I'd be married to a man who wasn't really committed, who didn't truly love me, spending my life wondering when he'd leave or what I'd done wrong. Instead, I'm free to be with someone who actually wants to be with me. So yes, his loss really is your blessing, but it's mine too." Everett helped her into the buggy, then climbed up beside her. Before he picked up the reins, he turned to her. "Eleanor, I know we've only been courting officially for a little over a month, but I need you to know something. I love you, I'm in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day." Eleanor's breath caught. "Everett, I love you too. So much that it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Everett said softly. He reached up and gently cupped her cheek. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise you that." Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was Eleanor's first real kiss. Thomas had been too respectful during their courtship, and she'd thought that meant he valued her. Now she realized he just never felt enough passion to want to kiss her. But Everett's kiss was different. It made her feel cherished and desired and completely safe all at once. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Eleanor was smiling. "We should probably head back before my father comes looking for us." Everett laughed and picked up the reins. As they drove through the cool October night, Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling happier than she could ever remember being. The weeks that followed were golden. The autumn weather was beautiful, crisp and clear, the prairie grasses turning shades of gold and amber. Everett and Eleanor spent every moment they could together, and their love deepened with each passing day. They talked about the future, about dreams and plans. Everett confided that he'd been saving most of his wages, that he hoped one day to have his own small ranch. Eleanor shared that she'd always wanted children, a house full of them, full of laughter and love. In November, as the first snows began to fall, Everett came to the homestead one Sunday with unusual formality in his bearing. He asked to speak with Samuel privately, and the two men went into Samuel's workshop while Eleanor and Martha waited in the house, both of them knowing what was happening. When they emerged 15 minutes later, Samuel had tears in his eyes and a broad smile on his face, and Everett looked both relieved and nervous. Samuel clapped him on the shoulder and sent him toward the house, and Everett practically ran to the door. Eleanor met him on the porch, her heart pounding. "Well?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "He said yes," Everett said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Eleanor, your father gave me permission to ask for your hand, so I'm asking, will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Eleanor didn't even have to think about it. "Yes," she said, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, absolutely yes." Everett lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. When he set her down, he pulled a small box from his pocket. "I wanted to do this properly," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it. "It's not much, but it was my grandmother's ring. My mother gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. And that's you, Eleanor. It's always going to be you." Eleanor took the ring with trembling fingers. The garnet glowed deep red in the winter sunlight, and the gold band was worn smooth with age. It was perfect. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and I'm honored to wear it." Everett slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They stood there on the porch, holding each other, both of them crying happy tears while Martha watched from the window with her handkerchief pressed to her face, and Samuel stood in the doorway of his workshop, grinning like a fool. They decided to marry in the spring, giving them time to prepare properly. Eleanor wanted a small ceremony, just family and close friends, and Everett agreed completely. Neither of them needed anything grand or fancy. They just needed each other and the people they loved to witness their commitment. The winter months were busy ones. Everett continued working at the Morrison Ranch, but spent every spare moment working with Samuel to build a small cabin on a piece of land Samuel had been holding on to, intending it for Eleanor when she married. It was about a half-mile from the main homestead, close enough for Eleanor to visit her parents easily, but far enough to give the young couple privacy. Eleanor and her mother worked on her trousseau, sewing sheets and pillowcases and curtains for the new cabin. Eleanor made herself 3 new dresses, including a simple white muslin for the wedding. It wasn't as elaborate as the dress she'd worn for the wedding that never happened, but it was pretty and practical, and she'd made it with her own hands with love in every stitch. Everett's sister, Caroline, came from St. Louis in March to meet Eleanor and help with the wedding preparations. She was a lovely young woman with Everett's kind eyes and a warm, open manner that made Eleanor like her immediately. The two women became fast friends, and Caroline confided that she'd never seen her brother so happy. "He writes to me about you constantly," Caroline told Eleanor one afternoon as they worked together on decorating the little cabin. "Every letter is Eleanor this and Eleanor that. I was actually a little worried I'd meet you and you'd turn out to be awful, and I'd have to figure out how to tell him." Eleanor laughed. "And what's the verdict? You're perfect for him," Caroline said sincerely. "You make him happy in a way I've never seen before. And I can tell you love him just as much as he loves you. That's all I could hope for my brother." The night before the wedding, Eleanor lay in her childhood bed for the last time, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow she would become Eleanor Foster, would start her life with the man she loved. She thought briefly about Thomas, about the wedding that never happened, and she felt nothing but gratitude that things had turned out the way they had. If Thomas had gone through with the marriage, she never would have known what real love felt like. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, a perfect April morning in 1879. The ceremony was held in the same little chapel where Eleanor had been left standing less than a year ago, but this time everything was different. This time, when Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Everett was standing at the front watching her with such love and devotion that she felt her eyes fill with tears. This time, when the Reverend asked if anyone objected to the marriage, there was only warm silence. And this time, when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Everett kissed her with a passion that made the small gathering cheer and laugh. The celebration afterward was held at the Norton homestead, with tables set up outside laden with food that the community had contributed. There was music and dancing, and Eleanor danced with her new husband more times than was probably proper, but she didn't care. This was her wedding day, and she was going to enjoy every moment of it. As evening fell and the guests began to leave, Everett and Eleanor said their goodbyes and walked hand in hand to their new cabin. It was small but cozy, just 3 rooms. A main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bedroom, and a small storage room. But it was theirs, built with love and care, and Eleanor had never seen anything more beautiful. Everett carried her over the threshold, another tradition, and then set her down gently in the middle of their main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Foster," he said softly. "It feels right," Eleanor said, looking around at the space that was now theirs. "Being here with you, starting our life together. Everything feels right." That night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Eleanor marveled at how much her life had changed in less than a year. She'd gone from the humiliation of being left at the altar to the joy of marrying a man who truly loved her. She'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that could happen actually opened the door to the best thing. "What are you thinking about?" Everett asked, running his fingers through her loose hair. "About how lucky I am," Eleanor said. "About how what seemed like the worst day of my life led me to you." "I think about that too," Everett admitted. "About how I almost didn't stop at that chapel, how I nearly just rode on through Buffalo without stopping. What if I had? I would have missed out on the best thing that ever happened to me." "But you did stop," Eleanor said, turning to face him. "You saw someone who needed help and you stopped." "That's who you are, Everett. You're the kind of man who helps people, and I love you for it." "I love you too," Everett said. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, both of them content and happy and deeply in love. The months that followed were an adjustment, as all new marriages are, but Eleanor and Everett navigated them together. Everett continued working at the Morrison Ranch, now saving money for the day when he could buy his own land and cattle. Eleanor took in more sewing work and helped her mother at the homestead, while also learning to manage her own household. That first summer together was hard work, but joyful. They planted a garden, and Eleanor learned to preserve vegetables for the winter. Everett built a chicken coop, and they got their first hens, and Eleanor discovered she enjoyed caring for the silly birds and collecting their eggs. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit on the porch of their little cabin and watch the sun set over the prairie, talking about their days and their dreams. In July, Eleanor realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she didn't say anything to Everett, not wanting to get his hopes up in case she was wrong. But when another month passed and she began to feel sick in the mornings, she knew. She was pregnant. She told Everett one evening after dinner. He'd just come in from doing the evening chores, and Eleanor was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew even though dinner was already cooked. She was nervous, though she didn't quite know why. They'd talked about wanting children, but somehow, announcing it felt momentous. "Everett," she said, not turning around, "I have something to tell you." "All right," he said, and she could hear the concern in his voice. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's wonderful," Eleanor said. She set down the spoon and turned to face him. "I'm going to have a baby." "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Everett just stared at her, then his face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen. "Really? Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be," Eleanor said. "I've missed 2 courses and I've been sick in the mornings. My mother says those are pretty clear signs." Everett crossed the room in 2 long strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet. "This is the best news," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor, we're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, even though she could see that he was. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Everett said. He set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "Are you happy? I know this is happening pretty quick." "I'm thrilled," Eleanor assured him. "A little scared, but mostly thrilled." "I'll take care of you," Everett promised. "Both of you. I'll work harder, save more. We'll make sure this baby has everything it needs." "This baby has everything it needs already," Eleanor said, placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "It has 2 parents who love each other and will love it. That's what matters most." The pregnancy progressed normally, though Eleanor found the morning sickness difficult for the first few months. Her mother was a great help, teaching her remedies to settle her stomach and reassuring her that the sickness meant the baby was strong and healthy. Everett was attentive almost to the point of being overprotective, worried about Eleanor overworking herself, insisting she rest more than she wanted to. As fall approached, and Eleanor's belly grew round and obvious, she found herself filled with a sense of peace and rightness. This was what she was meant to be doing, building a life and a family with Everett. Sometimes she thought about Thomas and wondered what her life would have been like if he'd gone through with the wedding. She probably wouldn't be pregnant now. Thomas had always been vague about when he wanted children, and she certainly wouldn't be as happy. Whatever life she might have had with Thomas, it wouldn't have had this sense of complete contentment and love. In late February of 1880, during a cold snap that had everyone huddled near their fires, Eleanor went into labor. It was evening, and Everett had just returned from work when Eleanor felt the first pain. She'd been having false labor for weeks, so at first she thought it was just more of the same. But as the pains continued and grew stronger, she realized this was the real thing. Everett immediately rode to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, an older woman who delivered half the babies in the county, and then went to get Eleanor's mother. Eleanor tried to stay calm, remembering everything her mother and Mrs. Patterson had told her about what to expect, but as the labor progressed and the pain intensified, she found herself crying out despite her best efforts. "You're doing wonderfully, Mrs. Patterson encouraged, her weathered hands gentle but competent as she checked Eleanor's progress. "First babies often take their time, but this one seems eager to meet you." Martha held Eleanor's hand and wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragements. Everett paced in the main room, occasionally calling through the bedroom door to ask if Eleanor needed anything, if she was all right, if there was anything he could do. "You can stop worrying," Mrs. Patterson called back at one point. "Your wife is strong and everything is progressing just as it should." Finally, after hours of labor that felt like days, Eleanor felt the overwhelming urge to push. Mrs. Patterson positioned her and guided her through the process, and with one final tremendous effort, Eleanor felt the baby slip free. For a moment, There was silence, and Eleanor's heart seized with fear. Then a lusty cry filled the room, and Mrs. Patterson laughed with delight. "It's a boy," she announced, holding up the red, squalling infant, "and he's got a fine set of lungs on him." "A boy," Eleanor repeated wonderingly as Mrs. Patterson cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. "We have a son." "You do indeed," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, honey, he's beautiful." Mrs. Patterson placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, and Eleanor looked down at her son for the first time. He was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair that looked like it might be the same brown as Everett's. His tiny fists were clenched, and he was making small, mewling sounds as he rooted around, already looking for food. "Can Everett come in?" Eleanor asked. "Of course," Mrs. Patterson said. "Just let me tidy up a bit first." A few minutes later, Everett was allowed into the bedroom. He looked terrified and awed in equal measure as he approached the bed where Eleanor lay with their son in her arms. "It's a boy," Eleanor said softly. "We have a son, Everett." Everett sank onto the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the baby. "He's so small," he said wonderingly. "And perfect." "Eleanor, you did amazing. He's amazing." "Do you want to hold him?" Eleanor asked. Everett looked nervous but nodded. Eleanor carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the head. Everett held his son with a kind of reverent care, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of such pure love that Eleanor felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "Hello, little one," Everett said softly. "I'm your papa. And I promise you, I'm going to do everything in my power to give you a good life. You're going to grow up knowing you're loved and wanted every single day." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. They discussed names but hadn't definitively decided on anything. "What about Samuel?" Everett suggested. "After your father, he'd be proud to have a grandson named for him." "Samuel Foster," Eleanor said, trying it out. "I like it. Samuel Everett Foster." "That's a strong name," Martha said approvingly from where she'd been standing discreetly in the corner. "Your father will be over the moon." Samuel Norton was indeed thrilled when he came by the next morning to meet his namesake. The big blacksmith held his tiny grandson with surprising gentleness, and Eleanor saw him wipe away tears when he thought no one was looking. The weeks after Samuel's birth were exhausting but wonderful. Eleanor was tired constantly from the nighttime feedings, and learning to care for an infant while managing a household was challenging. But every time she looked at her son, every time Everett came home from work and immediately went to hold the baby, talking to him about his day as if the infant could understand, Eleanor felt a surge of love and gratitude for the life she'd been given. When Samuel was 3 months old, Everett came home with exciting news. Henry Morrison was retiring and selling off portions of his ranch. He was offering Everett the chance to buy a section of land with good water and grazing along with 50 head of cattle, with the option to pay over time rather than all at once. "It's a good deal," Everett said, his eyes shining with excitement. "Better than I ever thought I'd get. We could have our own ranch, Eleanor. Build it into something we can pass down to Samuel and any other children we're blessed with." "How much would the payments be?" Eleanor asked, practical even in the face of such an opportunity. Everett told her, and Eleanor did the mental calculations. It would be tight, but they'd been saving diligently since their marriage, and if she took in more sewing work and they were careful with their spending, they could do it. "I think we should do it," Eleanor said. "It's what you've always dreamed of, and I want that for you. For us." "It'll mean hard work," Everett warned. "Really hard work, especially the first few years. We'll be building everything from scratch." "We can handle hard work," Eleanor said confidently. "Look what we've already built together." So Everett accepted Morrison's offer, and by summer, They were the proud owners of 320 acres of Wyoming rangeland. They continued living in the little cabin near the Norton homestead, while Everett worked on building a more substantial house on their new property, one big enough to accommodate a growing family. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sundays after church, and Samuel and several of the other men from the Morrison Ranch, who'd become Everett's friends, helped when they could. By the time Samuel was walking, sturdy and curious about everything, the new house was finished. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was solid and weathertight, with 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a main room with a fireplace. There was a barn for the animals and a corral for the horses. It was a working ranch, small but with potential, and Eleanor had never been more proud. They moved in on a bright day in October of 1881, with Eleanor's parents helping transport their belongings. Samuel tottered around the new house, exploring every corner while Eleanor arranged their furniture and belongings. That night, after Samuel was asleep in his new room and they lay in their bed in their new house, Everett pulled Eleanor close. "We did it," he said. "We've got our own place, our own ranch. I couldn't have done this without you, Eleanor. Your faith in me, your support. You've made all my dreams come true." "You've made mine come true too," Eleanor said. "This life we have, it's better than anything I ever imagined, better than anything I thought I wanted with Thomas." "Do you ever think about him?" Everett asked. It was the first time he'd brought up Thomas in months. "Not really," Eleanor said honestly. "Sometimes I remember that day at the chapel, how awful it felt. But then I remember that you walked in, this cowboy I'd never met, and you were kind to me when you had no reason to be. And that kindness led to friendship, which led to love, which led to all of this. So when I think about Thomas leaving me at the altar, mostly I just feel grateful. His loss really was your blessing, and mine." "And mine," Everett agreed. He kissed her forehead. "I love you, Eleanor Foster. More every day." "I love you too," Eleanor said. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Everett was a good cattleman, knowledgeable and hardworking, and Eleanor proved to be just as capable. She learned to ride well enough to help with the cattle when needed, kept the books for the ranch, and managed their finances carefully. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable and they were happy. In 1883, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose Martha Foster, after the wild roses that grew along the creek on their property and Eleanor's mother. Rose was a quieter baby than Samuel had been, but she had her father's eyes and her mother's determination. Samuel, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, from fetching diapers to singing her his own made-up lullabies. 2 years later, in 1885, another daughter arrived, Emma Caroline Foster, named for no one in particular, but because Eleanor and Everett simply liked the names. Emma was a sunny baby, always smiling, and she brought even more joy into their already happy household. By 1887, the Foster Ranch was well established. They'd increased their herd to over 200 head, had hired a young cowhand named Billy to help with the work, and had built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family. Eleanor had also achieved her dream of doing dressmaking professionally. Women from Buffalo and the surrounding ranches regularly commissioned her to make dresses for special occasions, and her work was in high demand. Samuel was 7 now, tall for his age and already showing signs of being a good rancher like his father. He could ride almost as well as Everett, and he took his responsibilities seriously, helping with the chores and watching out for his younger sisters. Rose was 4, imaginative and creative, always making up stories and drawing pictures. Emma was 2, into everything with the fearlessness that seemed to be her defining characteristic. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Everett and Eleanor sat on their porch watching the stars come out. It was something they did often, this quiet time together after the busy day ended. "You remember the first time we sat together like this?" Everett asked. "On your parents' porch, that first Sunday I visited, I remember," Eleanor said. "I was so broken then, so sure I'd never be happy again, and you were so patient with me." "I knew you were worth waiting for," Everett said. "I think I fell in love with you that very first day, when I saw you standing in that chapel in your wedding dress. You looked so beautiful and so sad, and I just wanted to make you smile." "You've made me do a lot more than smile," Eleanor said. "You've given me a life I never dreamed possible. 3 beautiful children, a successful ranch, a love that just keeps growing stronger. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe it's real." "It's real," Everett assured her, "and it's only going to get better. I was thinking, maybe in a few years, when the kids are older, we could build that addition to the house you've been wanting. The one with the big room where you could do your sewing and dressmaking, maybe even teach classes if you wanted." "I'd love that," Eleanor said. "You know what else I'd love? Another baby, if we're blessed with one." Everett grinned. "I'd love that too. Our house is full of noise and chaos and love, and I wouldn't change it for the world." As it turned out, they were blessed with one more child. In the spring of 1888, Eleanor gave birth to their 4th and final child, a son they named Jacob Theodore Foster. Jacob was a large baby, healthy and loud, and he completed their family perfectly. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and raising children. Samuel grew into a fine young man, taking on more and more responsibility at the ranch, and making it clear that he intended to take over the operation one day. Rose discovered a talent for painting and sold her watercolors of prairie scenes to the growing number of tourists visiting Wyoming. Emma turned out to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and intuition. And young Jacob, energetic and curious, kept everyone on their toes with his adventures. Eleanor and Everett's love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences, weathering hard times together and celebrating triumphs. They'd built something lasting, something meaningful, something worth every moment of hard work. One day in the summer of 1895, Eleanor was working in her sewing room, which Everett had indeed built for her 5 years earlier, when she heard a commotion outside. She looked out the window to see a familiar figure riding up the lane, someone she hadn't seen in 17 years. Thomas Garrett looked older, worn down by hard living. His clothes were shabby, and he rode a horse that had clearly seen better days. Eleanor felt nothing but mild curiosity as she watched him dismount in front of the house. No anger, no hurt, not even satisfaction at seeing how far he'd apparently fallen. Just a distant sense of observing someone from her past who no longer had any power over her present. She went out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Everett had been working in the barn and came striding over when he saw they had a visitor, concern evident in his expression. "Hello, Eleanor," Thomas said awkwardly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Thomas," Eleanor acknowledged, "this is unexpected. What brings you by after all these years?" "I was passing through on my way to Montana," Thomas said. "I heard you'd married Everett Foster, built a successful ranch. I wanted to see for myself, I guess, and to apologize if you'll let me." "There's no need," Eleanor said honestly. "What happened between us was a long time ago." "There's every need," Thomas insisted. "What I did to you was unforgivable, leaving you at the altar, humiliating you in front of the whole town. I was a coward and a fool, and I've regretted it every day since." Everett had reached the porch and stood beside Eleanor, not quite touching her but his presence clearly protective. "Mr. Garrett," he said with a nod. "Mr. Foster," Thomas responded. He looked between them, and Eleanor could see recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're the one who was there that day, aren't you?" "At the chapel?" "I am," Everett confirmed. "And I'll be grateful for the rest of my life that you made the choice you did." Thomas flinched slightly, but he nodded. "You've taken better care of her than I ever would have. That much is obvious." "She looks happy, truly happy." "I am happy," Eleanor said. "Thomas, I forgive you for what you did, if that's what you came here for. More than that, I thank you. If you'd married me, I never would have found the life I was meant to have, the man I was meant to be with." "So there's nothing to forgive, really. Things worked out exactly as they were supposed to." Thomas's eyes were bright, and Eleanor realized he was fighting back tears. "That's generous of you, more generous than I deserve. I've made a mess of my life, Eleanor. Chased dreams that turned out to be nothing but fool's gold. Never found what I was looking for because I gave up the best thing I ever had." "You'll find your path," Eleanor said gently. "It just wasn't with me. That's not a tragedy. That's just life." Thomas nodded, seeming to accept that. He looked around at the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle visible in the distance, the sounds of children's laughter coming from somewhere behind the house. "You've built something real here," he said. "Something lasting. I'm glad, Eleanor, I really am." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I wish you well, Thomas. I truly do." Thomas tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away. Eleanor and Everett watched him go, standing close together on their porch. "Are you all right?" Everett asked once Thomas had disappeared down the lane. "I'm perfect," Eleanor said, turning to look at her husband. "Seeing him just reminded me of how blessed I am. How lucky I am that you walked into that chapel 17 years ago." "I'm the lucky one," Everett said, pulling her into his arms. "His loss was my blessing, remember." "Our blessing," Eleanor corrected, standing on her toes to kiss him. "Our blessing." That evening, the entire family gathered for dinner around the large table Everett had built when Samuel was young. Samuel was 19 now, talking animatedly about plans to expand the herd. Rose, 16, was showing her mother sketches for a new series of paintings. Emma, 13, was describing a particularly difficult horse she'd been working with. And Jacob, 7, was chattering about everything and nothing, full of energy and excitement about life. Eleanor looked around the table at her family, at her husband, at the life they'd built together, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The worst day of her life had led directly to the best days, to this, to love and family and purpose. "What are you smiling about?" Everett asked, catching her expression. "Just thinking about how everything worked out," Eleanor said. "How sometimes what we think we want isn't what we need at all." "And sometimes," Everett said, reaching over to take her hand, "a cowboy walks into a chapel at exactly the right moment and finds exactly what he needs." "His loss was your blessing," Samuel said, grinning. He'd heard the story of how his parents met many times. "Our blessing," Everett and Eleanor said together, and the entire family laughed. The years continued to unfold in their natural rhythm. Samuel eventually married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and they gave Eleanor and Everett their first grandchildren. Rose moved to Cheyenne to pursue her art, but came home often, eventually marrying a professor from the university there. Emma took over more and more of the horse training operations on the ranch, becoming known throughout the region for her skill. And Jacob, after a few wild years, settled down and went into business with his father and brother, expanding the Foster Ranch into one of the most successful operations in northern Wyoming. Through it all, through every joy and every challenge, Eleanor and Everett faced life together. They'd started with nothing but love and determination, and they'd built an empire of sorts, not of money or power, but of family and community and lasting happiness. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, their children threw them a party that brought together half the county. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made herself from the finest fabric she could order, and Everett wore a new suit his daughters had commissioned specially. They danced together under the same stars that had watched over them through all those years, and Eleanor thought back to that scared, humiliated young woman in a wedding dress standing in an empty chapel. "Thank you," she said to Everett as they swayed together to the music. "For what?" he asked. "For stopping that day," Eleanor said. "For being kind when you didn't have to be. For being patient when I needed time. For loving me so well for all these years." "Thank you for giving me the chance," Everett replied. "For seeing who I really was. For building this life with me." "I meant what I said that very first day, you know." "What's that?" "His loss is my blessing," Everett said. "Every single day, Eleanor, you're my blessing." Eleanor smiled up at her husband, at the man who'd walked into her life at exactly the right moment and stayed by her side ever since. Around them, their children and grandchildren danced and laughed, the next generation of Fosters and the legacy of love that Eleanor and Everett had built together. It hadn't been easy. There had been hard times, lean years, losses and setbacks. But through it all, they'd had each other, and that had made all the difference. What had started with a cowboy's simple act of kindness to a heartbroken woman had grown into something magnificent, something that would last long after they were gone. As the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Wyoming sky, Eleanor and Everett held each other close and danced. Two people who'd found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it. His loss had indeed been their blessing, and that blessing had multiplied beyond anything either of them could have imagined on that painful day in 1878 when everything had seemed lost. But nothing was ever truly lost, Eleanor had learned. Sometimes things just had to fall apart so they could come together in a better way. And her life with Everett Foster, built on a foundation of genuine love, respect, and partnership, was proof of that truth. They'd built something beautiful together, something lasting, and as she looked around at all the people their love had brought into the world, Eleanor knew that their story would continue, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of kindness, patience, and true love. The party continued long into the night, filled with joy and laughter and the warmth of family. And when it was finally over and Eleanor and Everett returned to their home, to the bedroom they'd shared for 25 years, they fell asleep as they always did, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for every moment they'd been given together. Their story, which had begun with heartbreak and unexpected kindness, had become exactly what it was meant to be, a love story for the ages, proving that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are simply clearing the way for the best moments to come. Eleanor had been left at the altar by a man who didn't deserve her, and a cowboy had said his loss was his blessing. And from that moment on, their blessings had multiplied beyond measure, creating a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.